Sigils are the game-breaking buffs available only in Deadman mode. They're similar to League buffs, except they are GE-only tradable items you can turn on and off at the bank to buff yourself for whatever activity you're doing next. For new and returning players, they've added a bunch of new sigils and adjusted a bunch of the old ones, so there's tons to go through. I've gone through all the sigil effects and looked at the prices from the last Deadman and put them through a framework to rank them from F to S on what sigils are worth it and which ones aren't. I've ranked the sigils based on making money, PvP, PvM, and general account progression. Once you enter the game, you'll be able to choose a starting sigil and will receive a random tier 1 from your starter pack. So first, let's take a look at the potential starting sigils, although as we'll see, they've already made some changes that make it unclear exactly what we'll have to start with. Then we'll go through tier by tier. Let's get into it. Sigil of the Feral Fighter was the starting melee combat relic last time, but it has been removed. Not sure why, I guess it was just way too strong. It's unconfirmed, but I think we'll see this replaced with a tier 1 sigil that's been buffed from it. Sigil of the Ruthless Ranger provides a chance to damage over time, doubled in PvP when the enemy has no run. This was last year's starting range sigil. We'll see if they keep it as tier 2 starters this year, but this was the best early game PvP sigil, and they've buffed it even more from 5 to 15 damage. This getting buffed that much is huge even in PvM, not to mention PvP. With low agility and draining 30 run energy, unless people are full of stams, you're going to be starting to hit 30s very quickly. This will auto kill anyone in bracket 1, probably bracket 2, and might even be tough to deal with in the mid to higher brackets. That's a huge bleed effect. You're going to be killing quest bosses in no time at all, dragons, stuff like that, if this is something we get to start with. It's a B tier, maybe even an A tier. Same thing here for Menacing Mage. This was last year's mage starter, and you have a chance to proc a damage over time that also heals you instead of draining run energy. This is insane for PvM, as you just come equipped with essentially a Sang staff for any spell. Mage is going to be crazy in the early game with recent combat changes too. As an example, if you use Water Strike on a Fire Giant and you proc this sigil, you can hit a 34 in one hit at 13 magic. It's great for questing and training, you can always just sustain, it's going to be great for breaches, and if you get that Corrupted Shadow rolling, you'll be invincible in PvM. With the old starters out of the way, let's jump back to the tier 1s. Sigil of the Formidable Fighter gives huge melee stats and a chance at a big plus 10 hit. Our best guess at the moment with the removal of Feral Fighter is that this will be the new starting melee sigil. In the early game, this is very strong, with a max hit of 1 suddenly becoming an 11. You can just fly through the early levels. However, most people just quest these early levels, and plus 10 means less and less as your max hit grows. For reference, the plus 30 is massive, moving rune skims above D-skims in the main game, D-skims above whips, etc. in terms of accuracy. I think the price of the sigil will go up drastically compared to what's listed here, but it's not what Feral Fighter was. I think it's a solid B tier. Sigil of the Rigorous Ranger provides some range bonus and saves ammunition. This makes training with knives or the Dorg Seabow substantially better, as you need less money and ammo, and these low tier weapons now have stats comparable to a much higher tier weapon. It does save money and ammo, but with an accumulator unlocked at the start and relatively cheap good ammo, it's not that critical. C tier. Sigil of the Meticulous Mage provides hefty magic bonus and saves some runes. Good for saving early game cash once that starter staff wears out, and plus 40 is quite substantial. It makes full Mystic better than full Ancestral as far as mage bonus goes, and you'll be splashing way less in PvP and PvM. Strong B tier. Sigil of Resistance reduces monster damage by 25%. This sigil goes for extremely cheap because there are stronger alternatives, but remember this is already better than the effect of an Elysian. Even the weakest form of this sigil will help you at breaches or PvM content, and it goes for almost free the entire time. Sigil of Resilience restores your HP regen at 15 times. That's 15 HP per minute. Underrated as hell, especially in the early game. Getting a 15 heal per minute is actually amazing. Anywhere you slowly take passive damage like Warriors Guild, Agility Pyramid, Fight Caves, Inferno, any AFK training, it's just going to be like auto-consuming a monkfish every minute. There are totally better sigils, but as a tier 1 that is traditionally extremely cheap, it is a bargain. Sigil of Death Strikes. First in a series of 3, this buffs accuracy by 25%. It's good, but it's not as strong as it sounds. I could be wrong, but from my experience in using it previously, it's like taking your current hit chance and multiplying it by 1.2. So 50% becomes 60%, but 10% only goes to 12%. It's not like a flat 20% where a 1% hit chance goes to 21%. It's very okay. It's outclassed by higher upgrades, and frankly the higher combat sigils in a lot of situations are going to be way better. It sort of scales based on your hit chance already, so if you already have a good hit chance it becomes great, but if it's already too great it doesn't help, and if your hit chance is already poor it stays really poor. Relatively situational, and because there's so many other strong combat sigils, I'm going to leave it in C tier. Sigil of Consistency gives all of your hits plus 1 damage. This doesn't mean you never hit zeros, you can still miss, but when you do hit it's going to be at least a 1. This is good for chins, knives, things that have really low hits. It's not great, it's not good. It's pretty strong in the early game when you have a low max hit, C tier. Sigil of Barrows gives a pretty decent accuracy buff to a full Barrows set. The problem with this, of course, is getting a full Barrows set, and by the time you're doing that, pretty consistently getting that gear, I think you're going to be way past the Sigil. Just having an accuracy boost doesn't make it nearly as strong as some of the other Sigils. Not decaying is completely useless, it's not that expensive to repair stuff. I'm sure someone will go Darok bombing with it and it'll be funny, but as far as actually usefulness goes, there's so many better weapons than the Barrows weapons in this, you're not going to use this. Sigil of the Agile Fortune. This sigil is good but highly overrated. Most courses get you on average 10 marks per hour, which means 100k using the sigil. Even for the first hour, this isn't that great, and based on previous prices, it went immediately for 50k and quickly up to 100k. At that price, you'd have to spend an entire hour just to make back the investment. It scales poorly into the late game and has no other uses besides money making. Overall, if you get it in your starter pack, it may be worth running right to Draenor and using it, but certainly would not buy it and would honestly probably just sell it for 50k and do something better. Sigil of the Forager, nerfed down from 3 times to 2 times resources whenever you gather from fishing, woodcutting, or mining. It doesn't affect XP gain, but essentially doubles collection speed. Partner with sigils like Storage and Infernal Smith or Infernal Chef gives you safe money makers. Can easily make it early game fortune when food is in demand, and scales to the late game with high tier mining resources used for alching. Sigil of the Enhanced Harvest. Nerfed from 5 times to 3 times bonus resources, it's a direct upgrade to the previous sigil. However, there's a huge price tag difference. We'll see this trend a lot where there's a stronger version of the sigil that goes for 20 to 30 times the price. I highly recommend doing the math when you actually buy or sell these sigils on whether you're going to make up for it. For example, spending 100k on the previous sigil when you're making 100k an hour will pay for itself in an hour, but paying 3 mil for triple resources at the same moneymaker is going to take 10 hours to pay for itself. That's the main reason I haven't ranked these higher sigils drastically better. The price and value is so far off in a lot of cases for how much the upgrade actually is. Keeping this in the B tier because it's incredibly strong, but the price is also so high. And as we'll see later, as there's nerfs to the Infernal Sigils, it makes spamming Rune Ore that much less useful. Sigil of Storage. Store 90% of the resources you get from mining, fishing, and woodcutting go straight to the bank. This essentially lets you not bank if you're willing to drop the 10% that doesn't get sent to the bank. Incredible for training requiring dropping like Iron, where now it's less click intensive, or for money making where dropping the resources isn't too painful like at fishing locations. Incredible power for the price. Because it's also tier 1, unlike its improved version, you can also get it right away. For all those reasons, it's A tier. Sigil of the Abyss, nerfed from 10 times bonus runes to 5 times bonus runes while rune crafting. Still incredibly strong. Essence usually goes for around 25 GP, and natures go for about 250 to 500 depending on the day. That means 30 essence is about 7.5k, and turning that into 150 natures you can sell for 40 to 70k in a 1 minute walk is disgusting. Doing Into the Abyss and Temple of the Eye, which will take a fresh account under 30 minutes, has you set up for natures. I used this one last Deadman to great effect. It can also scale nicely into the later game moneymaker with high agility and completion of Shiloh Village, where you can quickly dip back over the wall, albeit with a high agility requirement of 70. A tier. Sigil of Hoarding, you get triple rewards from Guardians of the Rift, Wintertodt, Temporos. Pretty terrible, you're not going to see anyone really doing these activities. It's not a safe zone, so you're not going to do this with a group. It just doesn't really make sense. F tier. Sustenance saves you a lot of secondaries when you're doing herblore training. Again, this is super bad. All of these supply drops that come in Deadman mode from high level creatures are just going to give you all the potions, all the secondaries. You can buy potions with archaic emblems. They go around like crazy. Really not helpful. It'll save you a little bit of money if you're training herblore, but it's really just not necessary. F tier. Sigil of the Alchemaniac, 30% bonus GP from alching. This is insanely powerful, but not necessary to have as time goes on. The market will adjust to this over time, so selling your rune plate legs on the GE will just follow this price instead of the traditional alch pretty quickly. But it does make farming alchables that much better overall, and if you pull it early and rush 55 mage, you can turn things like steel plate bodies into a huge profit, and allow you to pick up other people's alchables for cheap and alch them before the market does adjust. C tier. The Sigil of Stamina provides infinite staminas. With 1 agility, you will still run out of run, but it's the best overall sigil certainly in the early game. It can help you finish quests, escape PKers, make more money. It's just like the main game, you use staminas everywhere. And especially on a fresh account with low agility, it's the most sought after sigil out of the gates. It is the best sigil to progress your account very early on and stays meaningful throughout the game. However, staminas become available pretty early in this game mode, and you can get them for pretty cheap. Because of that, we'll keep it in the A tier. Sigil of the Lithe gives you passive agility XP while you're running around the game. it's likely that this won't be boosted by the XP rates, which makes it fall off relatively quickly. In the early game, if there's no other sigils to take, it's certainly going to help you progress, but you're not going to take it over anything else as soon as you get other sigils. I saw a calculation that if you run for an entire hour from level 1, it'll get you 50 agility, but you're going to have a tough time running at that agility level as it is. If you pull it out of the starter pack right away, it could be useful to keep. I think people are going to overvalue it, and I would definitely give it a sell. You can make up for the XP you'll get having this on for multiple hours by doing only 1 or 2 quests. D tier. Sigil the Eternal Jeweler, super cheap sigil, pretty underrated. When games necklaces and dueling rings are about 5 to 10k each, this makes it so you only have to buy 1. Obviously it's not a great sigil for combat or anything like that, but it's pretty high value in the very early game. We'll give it a C tier. Sigil of Mobility lets you teleport without paying any GP, essentially, but you don't get any XP. The problem is you still have to carry these runes in your inventory, so it's not like it saves you a bunch of spots. Relatively useful again for saving money in the very early game, C tier. Sigil of Exaggeration boosts all of your non-combats by 5. Super underrated and useful for doing things like getting a whip earlier, mining rune earlier, and doing a lot of quests. Overall, it just shortens some grinds massively. Especially with nerfs to the infernal sigils, it makes it that much more viable to take in those gathering sigil builds with things like storage and forager, until you're at the level to gather without the boost. A tier. Sigil of the Treasure Hunter has been buffed to give 3 times drop rate for clue scrolls. This is actually better than it's given credit. Clue scrolls can be pretty helpful in the early game for getting alchemables and helpful in the late game for some of the God Wars gear like Ceridum and D'hide boots. Honestly, hunting clue scrolls isn't tremendously necessary, and there's so many other sigils to take that are probably better by the time you're hunting them. It's okay, you just wouldn't take it over anything else, so D tier. Sigil of the Food Master has been buffed to 40% chance to not eat a food. This is kind of slept on. It's not amazing when you look at other combat sigils, but in any area you want to stay for a long time, this essentially multiplies your food by 1 2/3. So for low level infernos, fight caves, or even just remote training locations, it means less banking, less money on supplies, etc. It just takes your supplies farther, and in a PvP situation, could give you the extra supplies you need to tank to safety. It's not great, it's not bad, C tier. Sigil of the Well-Fed gives you a 40% chance of doubling the healing from food. It's a very similar outcome to Food Master, your food can be twice as effective. It makes your food last longer, it could save you from getting comboed even better than Food Master, but it's pretty unreliable and in my opinion worse than Food Master. Another C tier for supply longevity. Sigil of the Potion Master, 20% chance to not drink a dose of a potion. Same thing as we've been saying so far, makes your supplies last longer, can help you in these kind of long-term situations like Inferno, fight caves, anything like that. Not the best sigil, not the worst sigil, C tier. Sigil of Deception, a new one where you auto pickpocket until caught. This is pretty terrible. I don't think it's even going to go for 20k. You're not really going to have the diaries done like you normally would in the main game either for increased pickpocketing chance. You're not going to have the thieving capes. You're still going to be failing all the time. You can't thieve in safe zones. I think this is F tier. That closes out the tier 1 sigils. Now moving into tier 2. Sigil of the Augmented Thrall has been buffed to do quintuple damage with your thralls. This sigil pairs amazingly with the Thrall Trinket, an item you can get in Deadman mode to summon a thrall without even being on the spellbook. This was already a very strong sigil last time with only 3 times damage. 5 times means this is probably going to be out DPSing you in a lot of places and a lot of stages of the game. This is like Guardian from Trailblazer Reloaded if you played that, but it's even better because it's 4 tick instead of 5 tick. I actually don't know why they buffed this so much. This is going to be absolutely insane. You're going to have a companion hitting 10s every 4 ticks on average. That's crazy. With absolutely no other items required. I don't know. This is going to be so strong. Sigil of the Lightbearer gives you increased special attack regeneration. This is going to be a pretty strong sigil. Special attacks are always really good. I think now that we're in the tier 2 zone, the other combat sigils outclass it pretty quickly, but it's not bad if you have a good special attack weapon. Situational depending on what you have, solid C tier. Sigil of Precision. This is the second in the series like Death Strikes we saw before, but now it gives a 50% accuracy buff. This was very expensive last time. It was the best accuracy sigil, but with the new 75% one coming out, this will probably drop in value substantially. You can't go wrong with this. The increased accuracy just helps everywhere, but you'll have to see situationally on what you're fighting if it's better or worse than the other combat sigils, which are also quite strong. Solid B tier, you could run this in any setup. Sigil of Specialized Strikes is now buffed to only have a 20-second cooldown. Overall, it reduces the special attack requirement by a flat 10%, so things like a DDS would go from 25% to only costing 15. This could be powerful, but the long cooldown made it unusable last time, and at 20 seconds, it's still very long. Also, a lot of good spec weapons take around 50%, so minus 10% isn't as strong as, say, a 25% spec weapon. But things like the VLS could be the exception. Overall, I think it just takes way too long to use effectively, and now that we're in these tier 2 sigils and you're getting a hand on those, I just don't think it's going to be competitive with any of the other tier 2 combat sigils. So, D tier. Sigil the Porcupine reflects damage to your attacker. They've nerfed the duration, but they've buffed how often you can use it. This sigil is just overall very powerful, because one of the best ways to defend yourself is to do damage back, because if people are eating, they can't do damage to you. I think it could be useful in PvM, and it certainly is in PvP, but because it's so expensive, I think I'm going to move it down to B tier. Sigil of Binding gives you an accuracy boost to your next bind spell. They buffed this to a 15-second cooldown, but it still does not need to be a tier 2 sigil. You have to take up an inventory spot to use it. I don't think it works on the ancient spellbook, so you're stuck on the standard spellbook. And if you look at the tier 1 sigil Meticulous Mage, it's going to give you a 40 accuracy bonus, which is probably better than this anyways. You could use this for like a free stand under, but in general, I just don't think this is worth taking in almost any situation. Maybe F tier, but we'll leave it a D. Sigil of Fortification sounds boring, but is incredibly underrated by giving you flat defensive bonus. This is like wearing an extra crystal shield for melee, or a d'hide body for mage, or 2 sufferings. It just makes people miss a lot if they get on you. They've even added a better version, so I expect this one will be relatively cheaper. It's useful everywhere, solid B tier. Sigil the Adroit increases your accuracy by 1% against players and NPCs for each hit point you're missing. This is like Death Strikes, except that it applies in PvP as well. Overall, I don't see why you would run this over something like the 50% Death Strikes buff. It could be useful in PvP, but you probably don't want to camp low HP in something like Deadman. Overall, it's fine, but it's kind of just like, why wouldn't I run the 50% Death Strikes buff instead of this? Overall, it's a D tier. Sigil of Onslaught lets your barrages and Chinchampas hit up to 11 targets instead of the normal 9. This is relatively niche. I'm sure players who are trying to push for rank 1s and get those really fast combat stats with chins and barrages will use this because it's just going to increase your DPS, but I feel like for the average player this isn't useful, and it's only useful for that one thing. It does one thing and it does it well. I think it'll be expensive for those players trying to push ranks, but for everyone else this is an easy sell. I think it's a D tier for most people to take. Sigil of Restoration gives you back HP for how much damage you deal in combat. This sounds good, but I think when you do the math, you'd have to deal 1,000 damage to heal your full HP pool. When you're looking at something like already having Meticulous Mage that grants you a kind of flat heal, I think this might be a little bit overrated. It could totally be useful in things like raids, but if you're already able to take something like Titanium or something instead that's going to reduce monster damage by upwards of 60% or have some flat defensive bonuses, I'm not sure if it's that good. It will 100% let you sustain somewhere longer, so depending on where you're using it, this could easily be an A tier, and maybe it even keeps you alive in PvP situations if you're able to do enough damage. It's a good effect, but I think people might be overhyping it. I think it's a B tier sigil. Sigil of Revoked Limitation lets the Ursine Chain Mace, Thamaron Scepter, and Webweaver Bow be used anywhere with their special effect. These weapons are going to go crazy and can hit upwards of 80, and they're 4-tick weapons or 3-tick for the Webweaver Bow. This sigil is going to be amazing if you can get it running. The problem is going to be paying for these Revenant weapons, paying for Ether continuously, and then even getting your hands on this sigil. I think it's going to be so expensive for most players, but if you get the setup running, it's going to be insane. The only downside is the ninja sigils, which are generally considered amazing, only work on 5-tick or slower weapons, so it may work on Thamaron Scepter, but all the other ones aren't going to benefit from that. Overall, I think the effects of this sigil are going to be absolutely insane, one of the best ones there is, but getting it running makes it so difficult that I'm going to put it in B tier. Sigil of the Ninja used to speed up 5-tick or slower weapons by 1 tick. Jagex has now turned this into 3 different sigils, 1 for melee, 1 for range, and 1 for magic. Last time the sigil was going for 100 mil, and it was still probably worth it. I think with these 3 new sigils, it'll be interesting to see what it costs. Most people only use ninja for one style. They would either go with a scythe or a shadow to a breach, do something like that. It's definitely a nerf in the sense that now if you wanted the same effect, you'd have to run all 3, but since most people are going to use one style at any given time, it shouldn't matter too much. I'm sure one of these will rise to be the most expensive, but in general I think they're all going to stay at an extremely high value since it's technically just as rare to get any one of them as it was to get the old one. It's worth noting that the range sigil will not work with the Bofo or Morrigan's throwing axes. Overall, I've moved it from S tier down to all 3 of these being B tier because they're so expensive, but it's going to depend tremendously on what the price of these actually is. It's an incredibly powerful sigil, but for 100 mil, it's really going to be difficult to get your hands on. Sigil of the Hunter guarantees triple Chinchampas from every catch. Chins are insanely expensive, with black chins being up to 5k plus in the first few hours. Catching triple chins means you can be getting 15k per catch. There's no great place to catch chins unless you grind out the Western Province's hard diary, but that will take quite a while. Therefore, it's a very high risk, high reward sigil where a few minutes of catching chins could be worth hours of other activities, but because it's likely to be an extreme hotbed of PKing, it's probably only viable during protection. B tier. Sigil the Infernal Chef got nerfed from a 100% chance to only a 20% chance to auto-cook fish as you catch them. It's still worth running when you're doing gathering, but makes room for things like exaggeration to jump to a higher tier resource earlier, since this effect won't save you nearly the time it used to. It does increase overall XP an hour since you're granted cooking XP, and still worth running, but this nerf should drop the price significantly. Overall, it's a C tier, nice to have, but not necessary like it used to be. Sigil the Infernal Smith gives a similar effect to Infernal Chef, where you automatically smelt your bars. This has also been nerfed down to 20% chance, which does still grant some smithing XP, but due to the nerfs for Enhanced Harvest and this, what was Apocalypse's best moneymaker will now be significantly worse. It's still going to make some cash, but significantly less than last time, and is going to take a pretty large investment to get to 85 for Rune. This will still provide some value, but expect a significantly lower price. Sigil of Nature lets you choose your farming contracts, which is relatively useless, and makes crops grow 5 times faster. This is pretty much used exclusively to train your farming faster, since herbs and potions are pretty cheap. Overall, this is just used to train a pretty unnecessary skill in Deadman and get you some extra points for leveling. C tier. Sigil of Devotion automatically buries your bones and scatters ashes with some bonus experience. It makes prayer training completely passive and is a great setup when you're doing Slayer, especially any burst tasks if you dare go into multi. It's good for people going for max levels, but is honestly a bit unnecessary. Going from 43 prayer to 70 in the higher brackets is only about 200 dragon bones, and lets you free up for another powerful Sigil. It's solid if you're trying to max prayer and makes bursting and Korend regenerate your prayer points, but for anyone not trying to max combats, it's overkill. If you're bursting necks or other ash droppers, it's definitely good, don't get me wrong, but it's worth comparing to other Sigils and asking if you really need those prayer levels. Overall, I think it's a little bit overrated, gonna put it in the B tier for that price. Sigil of the Bloodhound gives you a 75% chance on any step to finish the clue immediately. This is pretty underrated. Doing hard clues early can give you alchables that are extremely valuable when you're using Alchemaniac, and there are some sought after items like God Boots from the higher tiers. The point hunters for Deadman also can get some significant points for doing clues, and this makes completing them way easier. Partnered with some of the other clue sigils that are very cheap, you can stack up some quick completions for okay cash. It's very okay, C tier. Sigil of Faith gives a very similar effect to Well Fed, where you have a 40% chance of getting bonus restoration from your prayer potions. This can save you some money, or make things like the Inferno or the fight caves with drawn out encounters a little bit easier, but as a tier 2 sigil, when you're comparing it to other tier 2s, it just doesn't hold up, and is a solid D tier. Sigil of Prosperity gives you an additional 20% chance to hit the Deadman table. This gives a higher drop chance on the global loot table that has supplies, runes, herb secondaries, and most importantly, sigils. Overall, this is good, but it's overrated in my opinion. If you're killing level 150 plus monsters, your global loot chance is capped at 1 out of 75, so this only increases it to about 1 out of 62.5. Sigils can absolutely be amazing drops worth a fortune, but this could also just give you lobsters. At the stage of the game you're running this, you're now giving up other tier 2 combat sigils, things like Devotion, or keeping your stats boosted, or even some new sigils that let barrages and chins attack more monsters. It can be worth it, but if you can already kill 20% more monsters using a better combat sigil, it's equivalent and provides you other bonuses as well. It's a good sigil in the final bracket, but for this price, it's not worth running before that, and perhaps not even in that final bracket. C tier. The Sigil of Slaughter lets you pick your own Slayer task and acts as a buffed Bracelet of Slaughter, making the task last significantly longer. They nerfed this heavily from last time from 30 points to 60 points, and in a lot of cases, it's probably just better to get random tasks now. You can skip them if they're terrible, since this is essentially the cost of 2 skips per task if you pick them. Ignoring the task picking, it's still a solid sigil for making those good tasks count and last extremely long. This can really help you progress your Slayer level, which a high Slayer level is probably the best, most consistent moneymaker in Deadman as long as you have the time to invest getting it to a high level. Because Slayer isn't the best unless you really commit to it, and unless you're no-lifing with the streamers, you're not going to get there in time to farm whips, it's a B tier. It's a must if you're training Slayer, but most players won't grind it that high, and I think that's reflected in the already really cheap price from last time. Sigil of the Fortune Farmer allows clue scrolls to be stackable. This could be good if you're pairing it with Treasure Hunter, but as a tier 2 sigil, when you're already running these way stronger sigils, it just feels relatively weak. If you want to farm clue scrolls, you can just stop what you're doing and go do them. You don't need to wait for them to be stackable. If you really want to farm them, this sigil is extremely cheap and could be pretty useful, but for me, it's a D tier. Sigil of Versatility lets you change your spellbook using this sigil at any time as long as you have it activated. This is extremely strong and always worth having in the bank, that way you can switch using Thralls if you don't have the trinket, you can switch to Ancients, Standards, whatever you want, just let you get around the map a little bit better and change from activities since you're not going to have a player-owned house altar to do this. You're not going to use it all the time, but it's a solid A tier to always have in the bank, and it's definitely worth the price. Sigil of the Serpent clears poison and venom. It also grants you immunity to these effects for a buffed 10 minutes. The sigil used to be laughably bad, but now may be worth using before you go do something like Zulrah, if the effect persists even when the sigil is unattuned. Because it's so cheap, maybe this is worth grabbing since it'll be just a cheaper version of an anti-poison, but generally it's just completely outclassed by having an anti-poison and makes it completely unnecessary. Because you could potentially pre-pot with this and then go do something like Zulrah, and because it's just a 1k thing to permanently clear poison whenever you have it, just gonna leave it in the C tier. Sigil of Supreme Stamina gives you a huge buff to your current run energy and doesn't let it drain for an entire minute. This is just a better version of the Sigil of Stamina. With this, you will almost never run out of run energy. If you can get it early, it's amazing. The problem is it's tier 2, so it's going to come later than the Sigil of Stamina, and by that point you'll have done a lot of quests, you're already going to have a decent agility level, so you don't need staminas as much, and stamina potions will be really cheap and readily available. It's still worth it if you're doing any activity that drains your run, it'll save you some money, and can be used for things like rune crafting. Overall, it all depends on when you get it, but I'm going to put it in the B tier. Sigil of Preservation keeps your stats boosted forever. This one's kind of slept on and is incredibly cheap. It's not the best sigil, but it's useful both in combat and in non-combat. If you partner with something like Exaggeration that boosts your skills to +5, you can then take that off while this is still on and your stats will stay boosted permanently. It also means you can take a single dose of super attack and super strength and it'll be like having divine pots on all the time, which definitely increases your XP. Overall, it'll save you a little bit of money and some inventory space if you want to do some AFK training while staying at boosted stats. I think it's a solid B tier for the price. Sigil of Last Recall was nerfed down to a 5-minute cooldown and was moved down into a tier 2 sigil instead of previously being a tier 3. If you've played leagues, it does the same thing, it sends you back to the last place you teleported from. This sigil is insane, it helps a ton with quest progression and stuff like that. You're able to use it for rune crafting, which is an amazing combo last time, but with the 5-minute cooldown, it's going to make it way tougher to do any money making methods. This will be used primarily for camping some bosses in remote places like God Wars, or doing things like remote training locations that you don't want to run through a dangerous area to get to. All in all, it's extremely useful in just a ton of different places, so it's just a solid A tier. Finally, the tier 3 sigils. Sigil of Titanium is insane, it reduces all monster damage by 60%. Everyone was running this doing breaches or any of the PVM content, it essentially makes you a complete tank. It's extremely expensive, but it's still worth it. It's an S tier sigil. Sigil of Finality guarantees your next special attack will hit with a new buffed 30-second cooldown instead of the old 1 minute. It's strong in both PvP and PVM as you can guarantee something like an AGS hit or a Dragon Warhammer in PVM. The problem is getting your hands on these weapons, and a lot of the PvP weapons are already going to be incredibly accurate, so it's not totally necessary. Also, the cooldown being so long, even 30 seconds, means it's going to be tough to use this in a fight continuously. I think that's why we've seen it so cheap, and I think it'll continue to stay there. I think it's a solid D tier. Sigil of Pious Protection has been buffed to give you even more damage reduction against other players in PvP combat when you get your prayers right. This all depends on player skill level, so it's tough to judge, but if you're good at PvP, this is going to make you take way less damage and make it way less up to chance. If you're not a PvPer, it's not a good sigil. If you're a good PvPer, I think this is going to be a great sigil, so it's tough to put a number on it. I'm going to say it's average for the average person. I would get rid of it unless you're a solid PvPer. Sigil of Aggression gives you a 10% damage bonus, but you take an additional 5% damage yourself. Pretty much good everywhere. If you're a good PvPer on the offensive, it's going to feel great. If you're doing PVM, it's just like wearing a little mini Slayer helm all the time. Overall, it's just a great sigil, and the price isn't too ridiculous. A tier. The Sigil of Rampage gives you a stacking damage and accuracy bonus every time you switch attacks, meaning if you do magic, range, magic, you'll have a 9% accuracy and damage bonus moving forward. This is pretty much only useful in PvP, but is extremely strong as you get around a 10% bonus and no debuffs. It's an A tier sigil for PvP for sure. Sigil of Woodcraft is like Infernal Smith or Infernal Chef, but for wood turning into planks. It's tough to get this sigil early since it's tier 3, but essentially gives you a great moneymaker for chopping down trees of certain types. It's expensive and planks aren't always in high demand, but in the right situation, you can make a lot of money. B tier. Sigil of Remote Storage is a direct buff to the earlier storage relic. This one's tier 3, but sends 100% of your resources right to the bank. This was the best moneymaker when paired with something like Enhanced Harvest and Infernal Smith and mining rune ore. It's incredibly powerful and lets you AFK things like fishing permanently, but isn't that much of a buff over storage and is extremely expensive. Overall, it's an A tier relic. Sigil of the Guardian Angel prevents you from losing anything from your bank when you die. Instead, the sigil is consumed. I think this sigil is highly overrated. If you're smart with your bank and what your most expensive stacks are, you won't lose that much when you die. You also have the deposit box to keep 10 valuable items as well. If you're planning properly, you shouldn't lose that much from your bank, so overall I think this is way overvalued and not that helpful for most players. If it's cheaper for you to lose this than what you'd lose in your bank, then I guess it's worth it, but for most people this is going to be a D tier. Sigil of Meticulousness is the final version of Deft Strikes and Precision. It offers a huge accuracy bonus in PVM and is pretty much useful anywhere. You can't go wrong with this relic. I do think in a lot of situations where your accuracy is already pretty high, the other sigils would do just fine, and this one may very well be overpriced, but we'll have to see what it goes for. Depending on what you're doing, this sigil may or may not be as good as other things like the ninja variants, but it's always worth trying in any setup and could be great. Finally, we have the Sigil of the Rampart offering plus 100 in all defensive stats. This is huge. It's like having an additional Din's Bulwark on anything you're doing. If you pair this with something like Titanium, you will take almost no damage in PvM. By itself, you'll take almost no damage in PvP. It's a huge buff. People are going to be splashing freezes on you, missing with all their attacks. This is an incredibly strong relic. I'm sure everyone's going to want to run this one. It's going to be around 20 mil or more, and it's still worth it, S tier. And that's all the sigils. If you made it through to the end, thanks so much for watching. I'm going to be continuing to make additional videos on the upcoming Deadman mode, including 10 of the best ways to build your account. So subscribe if you're interested in more content like this. See you next time.